Nearly 8 years after the original, Rage 2 arrives on consoles, slathered in hot pink highlights, mutant entrails, and the fingerprints of a new development team. Avalanche Studios, best known for the Just Cause series, has picked up the series' reins, joining id Software to create something rather unique, a fast-paced first-person shooter combined with a large open world, and it works. But it's the approach to multi-platform development that we're most interested in today. You see, when tackling the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X versions of the game, the team made the decision to focus on performance rather than image quality. The result, 60 frames per second gameplay on the enhanced consoles versus 30 on the base machines. The question is, what was sacrificed to get there? And do all consoles hit the target? Today then, we're going to examine the visuals in Rage 2 across every console. Has Avalanche Studios' own Apex engine managed to deliver an id caliber experience? How do the consoles stack up visually? And what is the price of 60 frames per second? All that and more is coming up on Digital Foundry. For its day, the original Rage was an ambitious title. The objective, a large-scale AAA first-person shooter from id Software, targeting 60 frames per second on both PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. This was a tall order and one that few other developers managed last generation, but id, armed with id Tech 5, did manage to deliver. Unfortunately, this came at a cost. A static world with simplistic lighting and lots of texture pop-in. These limitations mostly centered around its reliance on megatexturing, a technique for storing texture data in a single large texture atlas of sort. Artists could arbitrarily draw detail as they pleased, but due to memory limitations of its era, near-field detail was lacking, thus textures only held up from a distance. Furthermore, shadow and lighting information was baked in, which limited both lighting quality and interactivity. These experiments in virtual texturing are fascinating and have yielded results in other titles, but last generation consoles just weren't quite up to the task. Rage 2, however, is a very different beast. While id Tech itself has advanced significantly in recent years, Rage 2 instead utilizes Avalanche Studios' in-house Apex game engine instead. The studio was selected as a development partner based on the strength of its technology in building games such as Just Cause and Mad Max. The engine supports large-scale open worlds with lots of physics and plenty of dynamic lights, a perfect fit for Rage. After all, the original Rage was designed to offer a Mad Max-like experience with a wide-open wasteland to explore, but id Tech 5 really wasn't well suited to such a large-scale project, thus the environments were very constrained and every mission was divided up by lengthy loading screens, killing the pace in the process. The Apex game engine, however, allows the team to deliver on that original vision, with a massive open world to explore filled with towns, settlements, and gorgeous views aplenty. It supports a fully real-time time of day system with variable cloud cover, plus real dynamic shadows and lighting. Yep, the completely static nature of the original Rage is no more. It's a beautiful world with dramatic sunsets, dynamic shadows, and a huge sense of scale. The engine can draw these large environments without any loading times between areas. You'll move from the wastelands to a mission, to a city, and back with zero interruption. It's all seamless now and it feels great. There are limitations, of course. Pop-in is visible, the more distant shadow cascades lack detail, and the ambient occlusion is often blotchy, but it still works as a whole. For me though, the key element here is lighting. The Apex engine utilizes a clustered forward approach to rendering, which enables many dynamic lights without some of the drawbacks associated with deferred rendering. Leaving behind the earthy tones of the first game then, the world of Rage 2 is painted with a beautiful palette. The pink hue of the sun as it appears just at the edge of the horizon is a sight to behold, as our missions set at night with colorful particles exploding across the scene. Rage 2 also features a fully volumetric lighting system, enabling beams of light to slice across the world, resulting in thick atmosphere. Everything from spotlights, sunlight, and more penetrate the thick, dusty atmosphere in a rather convincing manner, and it looks great on all platforms. Materials then are physically based and react beautifully to light, lending the game a very realistic feel at times despite the hyper-realistic aesthetic. Of course, the artwork itself is often of the lower resolution variety when viewed up close, but it's still a massive improvement over the original Rage. Lighting and materials then are enhanced by secondary light bounce. The Apex engine can back project the color of the ground to surrounding objects, which means if you have sunlight bouncing off the reddish-orange hue of the desert terrain, it will impact surrounding objects, lending them a slightly orangish glow. Of course, when tackling certain missions, the game will auto-adjust the time of day to suit that specific mission, just to ensure that the atmosphere is as the developers intended. Then we have the beautiful post-FX pipeline with very high quality per object and camera motion blur. It uses a high sample count and a perfect shutter speed, greatly enhancing the fluidity of the experience. Of course, for the heathens that prefer not using motion blur, the developers were kind enough to include an option to disable it entirely. You can do the same with Chromatic Aberration, by the way, though this is one effect that kind of works with the aesthetic of Rage 2. Screen space reflections also make a frequent appearance in Rage 2, with glossy materials like this, and wet surfaces such as this, taking full advantage of the technique. All of this then works in tandem with the impressive physics and destruction system on display. Dynamic objects are placed around every scene, and many of these explode and react to combat. While engaging foes, objects will break apart and explode around the scene naturally, lending extra heft to the combat, something that was completely absent in the original Rage. The combination of dynamic lighting, shadows, and physics is exactly what this game needed. Beyond this, the animation is also a high point. This is one area where the original Rage really excelled, with enemies reacting naturally to gunfire, and the same is thankfully true of Rage 2, and this is key to its combat feel. Enemies dart around the screen with weighty animation while reacting to weapons fire. It just feels right. Now, it's not as fast-paced as Doom 2016, mind you, but it has a similarly punchy and satisfying feel, and really, punchy is a good way to describe Rage 2 in general. It's clear to me that the influence of id Software has paid off in spades. The games previously developed by Avalanche failed to match what's been achieved in Rage 2, just in terms of gameplay feel. But there's a bit of a caveat there when discussing how it feels to play the game. You see, while the original Rage was focused on delivering 60 frames per second on the lowest common denominator, Rage 2 takes a different approach depending on which console you use. Rather than aiming to deliver improved visuals on mid-generation consoles, Avalanche has instead opted to focus on frame rate. In this case, that means Xbox One X, PS4 Pro, and the base PS4 all run at just native 1080p, while the original Xbox One instead renders at 900p. Not the typical split, is it? This is coupled with a very aggressive form of temporal anti-aliasing, which does soften the image and minimize most edge artifacts, but it goes perhaps too far sometimes, resulting in a surprisingly soft and blurry looking image. A touch of post-process sharpening might help just a bit, I'd imagine. Now, there doesn't appear to be any form of dynamic resolution unlike the original Rage, which used this as a major technical feature. There's always a chance, of course, and in this case it's nearly impossible to spot, as the TAA makes pixel counting borderline impossible in most scenes, but it's most likely static. The point is, though, resolution is one of the key things sacrificed in order to deliver a smooth frame rate in an open world game. There's a huge difference in terms of system demands between this and something like Doom 2016. Doom is a relatively confined game, while Rage 2 takes place in a very large open world with seamless transitions between different areas. And so the decision to differentiate the consoles by frame rate is interesting. After all, when these mid-generation machines were first launched, this is exactly what many had hoped would become standard: 60 frames per second for Pro and Xbox One X versus a lower frame rate on base machines. And now that we have it, was it worth it? Well, in my opinion, yes, but there are trade-offs. Firstly, you can't expect much in terms of visual refinement moving from base to enhanced consoles. All versions look extremely similar, with minimal advantages between the base and enhanced consoles. It's usually limited to stuff like this, where there's a light missing in certain cutscenes on the base systems.
That was my kill.
You gotta move a little faster, Walker.
You can see it here as well. There's a spotlight coming from the left that's absent on the base machines. Basically, there's more shadow casting lights visible on the Pro consoles versus the base systems. Most of the other changes, though, are even more subtle. Looking at this scene in the Wasteland, for instance, aside from the variation in cloud cover, it's almost impossible to tell the different versions apart. The team has focused on delivering a very specific presentation and have ensured that all platforms reach that bar. Now, I understand that this may disappoint some users, but honestly, the game does look pretty good across all platforms, despite the blur from the aggressive temporal anti-aliasing. Of course, it does seem possible that the enhanced consoles could have delivered a higher resolution with more refined visuals if the 30 frames per second frame rate target of the base machines had been maintained. Things like LOD pop-in, shadow quality, resolution, and the like are all kept on the lower side though in order to ensure 60 frames per second. Now if we step back for a moment, the low resolution and pop-in might seem a tad disappointing, but based on what I'm hearing on the PC side, this game is rather heavy on the GPU. Perhaps X could have pushed things up a tad, but I cannot imagine 60 frames per second remaining possible at higher resolutions. The point is, yes, there are visual trade-offs, but this game highlights just what it takes to deliver an open-world game at a high frame rate. It's an either-or thing. And yes, I can understand the disappointment as well. The game is rather soft on a large 4K display. There's no doubt about that. However, as I said, I feel the trade-off is worth it. The fluidity gained by aiming for 60 frames per second is a huge deal. But of course, this only applies to the enhanced consoles. If you're on the base systems, you're stuck at 30 frames per second, though the game still looks fantastic. So I guess the question here then comes down to performance. How closely can the mid-generation machines hold 60 frames per second? With all the sacrifices made to get there, does it really manage to hold that level of performance? Well, let's start with the most powerful platform, Microsoft's Xbox One X. This box does seem to deliver on the promise of 60 frames per second, and it does so in an almost flawless fashion. Nearly every major scene in battle I encountered held a locked 60 frames per second no matter what was happening on screen, and it feels amazing to play as a result. But that's not to say that dips cannot occur. There's this one sequence here in front of the Eden Center. If you look at the frame rate and frame time graph, you'll note that there is actually screen tearing and some slight slowdown on the Xbox One X, which honestly I didn't expect. It doesn't last long, thankfully, but this seems to be an especially heavy area, and it definitely does tax the system. Extrapolation suggests then that such a scenario could arise later in the game as well, but even still, moments like this appear to be suitably uncommon. It's not something you're going to need to worry about. The game is very, very stable, so Xbox One X definitely reaches the 60 FPS dream. But what about PlayStation 4 Pro? Well, first impressions suggest an experience very much on par with Xbox One X, but it's not quite as stable. So firstly, there's the Eden Center, and just like Xbox One X, the frame rate in this region does suffer on the Pro with slight dips and tearing. It's not optimal again, but thankfully, like Xbox One X, it doesn't last that long and it's not that severe. But what's different here, though, lies in the towns. Wander into most major towns on the PS4 Pro and you get results like this. The frame rate starts to dip just below 60 frames per second, and we start to see tearing along the top of the screen. Thankfully, the effect is mostly limited to the central area of the town, but it's still rather distracting. But if we switch over to Xbox One X and look at the same sequence, as you can see, there are zero issues. The entire city runs at a locked 60 frames per second on Xbox One X, and this applies to all the different settlements throughout the game that I've visited thus far. Aside from towns and the battle in front of Eden though, the game runs like a dream. In both cases, I've highlighted just the areas where I encountered dips. That means no other section during my playthrough exhibited any performance problems at all. So it's a very stable game, just a tad more stable on Xbox One X. But of course there's the base consoles, and well, obviously this is where things take a dive. As noted, these two machines operate at just half the frame rate of the other consoles, which means 30 frames per second. In the case of PlayStation 4, I wasn't able to uncover any performance-related dips at all during my testing. It delivers 30 frames per second evenly and locked. Perfect frame pacing, perfect persistence. It's very, very stable. The chance for slowdown certainly does exist, and it could occur in some areas, but I wasn't able to find any of them, which is always a good sign. And believe it or not, Xbox One S turns in similarly stable performance. I did encounter some very slight drops here around the Eden Center, but honestly, it's very stable for the most part and nearly a match for PlayStation 4. I guess the real thing here is whether or not you can get used to playing Rage 2 at 30 FPS. It is possible, but if you're switching between the two, it's pretty obvious that Rage 2 was designed for higher frame rates. The speed of the combat is simply a better fit for 60 FPS or higher, and the base systems wind up feeling a bit sluggish in comparison. The controls feel heavier and everything else just kind of feels less snappy. I'm reminded of playing Doom on Nintendo Switch in a way. It works, but it's not ideal. Still, when you see any version in motion, it's a beautiful game, and I feel that the developers have done a great job delivering a stable, lovely looking game across all consoles. Sure, the enhanced consoles take point on this one, but you'll still have a good time on the base systems if you can get used to 30 FPS. Another key victory for Rage 2 lies in its loading screens, or lack thereof. As noted earlier, this was a serious problem for the original Rage. Not only did each area require loading, but dying also triggered a very lengthy loading screen. That is no more in Rage 2. There's just one loading screen at startup, and another short one upon death. Outside of that, the game is completely seamless, and it's never cumbersome on any of the consoles. On a less positive note then, I was extremely disappointed to discover that Rage 2 does not support HDR. With its bright, vibrant color palette and blinding dynamic lights, it seems like a perfect candidate for HDR support, but alas, it is not here in this game at all. At this point, I kind of feel like HDR should be relatively standard across games, but support remains spotty. Whether a new game supports it is hit or miss, and even those that do don't always offer a correct implementation, if you will. So that's pretty much the gist of it then. And after discussing the game with others, I can see that this will be a divisive one, at least from a visuals perspective. Personally, I love the post-process heavy, colorful, well-animated look Rage 2 has going for it. It's exactly the type of visual design that I really enjoy, but the strong temporal anti-aliasing and lower overall resolution on consoles, not to mention the pop-in, isn't gonna work for everyone. So it does kind of come down to personal preference, and whether or not you're able to forgive these flaws in favor of such a smooth game. It's also fascinating to see a large open world game like this with fully real-time lighting and plenty of action target 60 frames per second on console and nail it. This is not a common thing. Most other similarly open world games settle for 30 frames per second at best, but Rage 2 is all about 60 FPS and I love it. Well, as long as you're playing on Xbox One X or PS4 Pro, that is. Now, of course, resolution was sacrificed, but I feel in this case at least, the price of 60 frames per second is fully justified. The gameplay benefits tremendously and it just looks so buttery smooth in motion. So the next time you ask for 60 frames per second in a game, consider titles like Rage 2 and understand what needs to happen to reach it. If this were a smaller scale game like Doom, then you could have both a higher resolution and 60 frames per second. It would certainly be more doable at least. But once you bring in the open world and the extra requirements that this entails, things start to become more challenging and you have to give up more to get to such a smooth frame rate. Perhaps in a way, Rage 2 offers us a preview of what's to come next generation. It's likely that we'll see plenty of cross-gen titles arriving on both next and current generation machines after all, and the frame rate is one area where we would expect to see some variation. We already saw that this generation with games like Battlefield 4, which launched at 60 FPS on Xbox One and PlayStation 4, but 30 or less on previous gen machines. I would expect further visual refinement as well between the different versions, but it does make a lot of sense to see a frame rate division in this fashion, especially if machines like Xbox One X and PS4 Pro continue to receive support. Either way, I definitely recommend checking it out, especially if you're running with one of the enhanced consoles. Rage 2 is a flawed gem for me. It's beautiful to behold, runs like a dream on these consoles, and it plays brilliantly. It's one of the tightest shooters I've played in quite some time, but the open world stuff just doesn't always hit, and some of the dialogue is downright boring.
We fought back to back, your kind and mine. Back in the war. Name's Mo Rummy. I'm just an old...
So in that sense, it's not on par with Doom 2016 in its amazing pacing, but it's still a brilliant shooter and one I've been enjoying. But that's it for the moment. If you enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like and subscribe, ring the notification bell at the top, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.
By the media they named Apophis, we had such plans, all thwarted.